Right. Okay. Brilliant. I'm really excited about this session. We've titled this Sales Competency Frameworks, the Unsung Heroes, but it's really going to be a practical session so that people can get really good takeaways, because I am loving the notion of digging into your brain and getting all of that amazing thought and practical advice out there. Before we go to that, let's introduce. I'll introduce myself. So Kate Lewis, I'm the co-founder and CEO, sales enthusiast of Aviva Enable, which is a competency coaching platform. Erin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Erin Evans. I work for an organisation called FlowState, who I'm one of the co-founders of. Fundamentally, we are sales enablement as a service. So if you imagine, sales enablement is a very broad term, right? Ranging from kind of sales ops all the way through to the delivery side of it, be it training or coaching. We basically help sales enablement functions increase capacity, increase expertise in certain areas. In some cases of our customers, we actually operate as kind of a de facto sales enablement function as well.
Brilliant.
I need to apologise. I've got some work going on at the moment. I think you may be able to hear in the background someone drilling, but yeah.
It's the background track to today's podcast. It's operating under pressure with a drill going on in the background.
So apologies about that.
No, that's fine. All right, thanks for that. Look, it sounds a bit like a cheesy dating app advert, actually, because you and I first connected, I reckon it was about 18 months ago now, but we probably first connected literally over our shared love of sales competency frameworks, right? And we've been geeking out over it ever since in various different conversations. So I know today we wanted to make it a practical guide so that people can get takeaways they can actually action. But I always like to start with the why. So let's ask the question, why are sales competency frameworks so important? Why are they the unsung heroes of the world? What's your perspective?
Yeah, well, it's first like remarking that I think one of the reasons why we connected and carried on talking is one of the real values that you have, which I love, is that you see the fundamental importance of a competency framework, right? And you know, one of the first questions we ask our clients is, do you have them? Because they are absolutely pivotal in running a sales organization. If you don't have them, you're starting from a standing position, which is never good. But like, a really good way of thinking about it, right, is that if you imagine that your organization has these big, scary goals that it needs to achieve during the course of a year or 5 years or 10 years or whatever the organizational objectives are, fundamentally, you need to distill those goals down into the capability, the skill, the behaviors, the processes, and the knowledge that the people need to have to achieve that outcome. Now, it's such a missing ingredient that people forget about. They just think, oh, we just need to hire some salespeople to grow by 20%. It's like, well, no, that's in principle, that sounds like a good idea, but actually that isn't connecting the dots between what you really need, which is an objective and a goal and a series of skills, a series of knowledge banks, a series of behavioral traits, a series of processes and functions and systems that actually feed into achieving that overarching goal. So the why behind this is really important, is that this goal that you're trying to achieve, be it at an organization level or departmental level, you need to understand the capabilities that the people involved in that objective need to have to achieve it. So whether that's you hiring into the business, whether that's judging their performance, whether that's promoting them throughout the organization, without that codification of those skills, behaviors, and knowledge, you're not really going to be understanding how you articulate that goal and ultimately go and actually get that output, which is that goal in the first place. So a really good analogy is like, well, we know we need to bake a cake. Okay, great. Well, let's bake a cake. Well, no, let's start with the ingredients. Like, what do we need and how much of it do we need, right? You're never going to achieve the end goal, the why of having a delicious Black Forest Gatto, if all you've got in the cupboard is a couple of pita breads and some butter. Like, well, no, that's not going to achieve the outcome we want. Right? That's what I love about you and the product that you have as well, is that what it does, what you do and what it does really quickly is it shines a light on the importance of achieving that part first before you can actually go and start thinking about how we go and achieve the goal in the first place. So hopefully that makes sense. But again, it's that codification of the core competencies within each role to go and achieve the goal. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. I like to think of it as like a blueprint, like a map. It says, you know, you wouldn't embark on any journey or any big thing without something. You know, it's an architect building or building a building without any plans. It's ludicrous that you would do that. So it's about having that blueprint and saying, as you say, distill it down into something that's manageable. That you can focus on, that you have an impact on, because the big goal seems really scary and a
Yeah.
long way away. And so it's kind of like having that something like, I've got something I can action and do today that's going to make a difference in the long run. So couldn't agree more. So it sounds like we both agree that it is
Yeah.
a bit of a superhero.
Yeah.
But I imagine there's people going, right, yeah, I get it. I've heard loads of times that we should have one of these, but where do I even start? Right, I've got a blank sheet of paper. For people who are going to listen into this, who are also sales competency geeks or would be sales competency framework geeks, where would you start? Like, what's some of the practical things that you would say if you were right at the beginning of your journey?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I'll talk you through the kind of process that we go through with our clients, because ultimately we feel that it helps them achieve not only the outcome of having a competency framework, but there's actually a sort of solidification of the management unit, the HR unit, and the senior leaders in the business during that process, because it creates alignment, which is really, really, really important. So me going off on my own and creating a competency framework in a room doesn't really have value, because the end result is the competency framework, which is great, but functioning on its own, it's not particularly valuable. It's got to have the buy-in, the alignment, and ultimately the kind of adoption of the organization, right? So where do we start? Well, look, the first thing we do is we get all the key stakeholders in a room and educate them on the importance of the competency framework. And then we get agreement from them that, first of all, this is something that they see is fundamentally going to be a building block for their business moving forward. So once we've gone through that education piece, we then start talking about what we call our non-negotiable competencies, right? And we have 3 competency categories, 5 competencies. They are typically skill, which is the absolute skill required to do the job.
Yeah.
Then there's knowledge, which is the knowledge that someone needs to be able to do the job. Yeah. Then we have systems and processes, which are what systems and processes do they need to be adapted or able to use. And then we have behavior, and then we have values as well, which is often just adopting the organizational.
Yeah, I agree.
And what we do is we give them a huge bank of competencies that sit in those areas, and we get them all in a room and we go, right, in those 5 or 3 categories, what do we perceive to be non-negotiables that every single person in the commercial organization needs to have in those categories? So this is a really interesting process for us, because we get to see the management group arguing, disagreeing. HR have different ideas to what the management group might have. Senior leadership might have different ideas to what the management or the HR group might have. And then we get them to agree on what those core competencies are that are non-negotiable, right? So now they're looking at it and they're going, we can look each other in the eye and hold each other accountable with every single person we bring into the business, every single person that we're managing or we're developing, every single person that's going performance management. We know that they have these competencies in the first place, which is really, really important, because we now have foundations of those competencies that are non-negotiable. So in what you've kind of done is you've inadvertently created almost like a values structure, I should say, amongst that group of people. So they can all look each other in the eye and say, well, look, this is our non-negotiables. We need to look at ourselves and see if we've got these values as well, right?
What I like about that as well is it creates a common language.
Yeah.
So it's like this is what we're all talking about, and we're all talking about the same thing here, and in the same way, which really helps further down the line in maintaining that kind of cohesion between everybody.
Yeah.
It is that commonality of language. You know, I really buy into that.
And we play a really important role in that, right? Because what we do is we challenge them, right? So we're constantly challenging, and we hear them really crystallize their beliefs in these competencies. And also inadvertently, they start pitching each other on these competencies as well and defending the competencies that they've chosen. And this process here can take up to a month, where they all finally agree on what those non-negotiables are, right? And remember, the key part here is that the people who are deciding what these non-negotiables are, they're typically the leaders in the organization that are going to be managing the reps that have these competencies. So it's really important, to your point, that they can articulate what that competency is. They understand what the descriptor is, and they understand the level of that. Sorry.
That was a loud one.
That's a loud one. It feels like it's really inside my head at the moment, so apologies. So again, like the point you made there is so important, right? Is that being able to actually articulate what that competency means and have a collective reference point around those competencies is so crucial. because we don't want my blue and your blue to be different, right?
Yeah.
If you're thinking about navy blue and I'm thinking about light blue, they're actually different colors. So we need to very, very quickly let us know that we're both talking about the same thing here. And that process is really, really important. Now, what you've got then is what you're left with in the organization, which is the first stepping stone, is you've got within those competency categories, you've got the core non-negotiable competencies. And then the next step is really interesting. We've got to start thinking about it from a couple of other perspectives and running it through a couple of other lenses, right? Number one is the role itself. So someone who's working in like a global accounts versus an SDR is now going to have a very different set of competencies that feed into their personal competency framework, right?
Yeah.
So now we have to start thinking about what's the core objective of this role? What's it trying to achieve? So if you're trying to grow AOV or trying to increase your MRR, you're not going to plug in their transactional selling as your competency because it's incongruent with what the business is trying to achieve. So it's really important that one of the kind of beacons that's shining light on this process is the objective of the department and the objective of the organization. Because then when you start adding your own herbs and spices to those individual roles and those different competencies, you've actually got a really good lens to look through to pick the right ones that are going to drive the right outcomes. Now, we do this as a sort of consultation period with the individual managers. We sit down with them and go, well, look, you've got your non-negotiables now. Now we need to build up the core competencies for the role, right? And also what the maturity curve for that role might look like as well, right?
Yeah.
Someone who's been an SDR for 1 month might have a completely different competency framework to someone who's been an SDR for a year and a half and is looking to move into the account executive role, right?
That would just does that in itself, particularly in the current climate with needing to keep that motivation and have a longevity in an organization, having those micro progression elements, even within a competency or within a role, is just so important.
Absolutely. And again, like, you know, like you say, like this, the tool itself is not designed to be a stick to beat people with. It's designed to be aspirational, right? It's a mutual plan between the manager and the rep to work on the core skills that are going to improve them to actually go on and do better in the role, or in some cases in their career, not necessarily just the role of the company that they're working in. And that's really, really, really important. So once we've mapped that out with the managers, and we've added all those herbs and spices on a role basis and on the maturity curve of that role as well, we've now got a complete competency framework, right? Now, people often at this point sit there and look at it and go, great, we've got a competency framework. We've got a sort of a dispassionate list of competencies for each role. And then they're stuck. Well, what do we actually do with it? And this is where it really, really comes alive. Do with that information.
That was going to be exactly my next kind of delve point, because I think there's a lot of people that might be listening that say, well, we've got one. It's gathering a bit of dust in a drawer, but we went through that process 2 years ago. It probably needs a bit of a refresh, but it never really got off the ground. So, you know, you've got your framework, and it's brilliant progress. And that's what I always say to people when I've spoken to them. But what is it that you do with it? How do you get value out of it? How do you fit it into the operational framework of a sales team? You know, and what's your perspective on that, Aaron?
Oh my God, it's like, you know, it's like a Swiss Army knife. It's got so many different uses. And this is why we, you know, whenever we go into an organization, like I said before, and I can't hammer home this enough, is that we make sure that they have a competency framework. If not, we recommend that we build one straight away. So let's look at it from the life cycle of a representative or a salesperson within an organization. Well, the first one is, how do we understand the talent that we even need in the business, right? So when you're going through your talent selection or interview process, all of a sudden you've now got a blueprint for each role and what you need that person to demonstrate during the interview process. This is one of the most underutilized and underdeveloped skills that managers have, is being able to interview to a shopping list of core competencies they need and get the candidate to demonstrate those competencies. So let's say all of a sudden we can build out a recruitment scorecard based on the competency framework. You've got the competencies, you need merely put a scoring mechanism next to it. And now you've got the focus of where you want to understand the candidate is in those competencies, whether they haven't, whether they don't have them, right? Number one, so it's how you actually attract the talent. Then you onboard the talent. Now, the competency framework for the onboarding for that particular role should align to the curriculum that you're training them in the onboarding, right? So all of a sudden you've got the list of competencies and you've got the module, you've got the learning content, you've got the digital assets that they can actually learn about those competencies in that process as well. Now think about that, right? Like knowledge banks as an example. Learn about the market, learn about the personas, learn about the competitors, learn about the product itself. You should be aligning your competency framework to the curriculum that falls in there, right? And then someone's in the job for a little while, they're showing some success. We should be running personal development programs, quarterly reviews on their performance. Instantaneously, we've got something there that's taking care of the macro, so their performance during a quarter. We can start actually grading them and scoring them against those competencies, and also talking about potentially, if they've been in a job long enough, getting them to focus on the competencies for the next role. So you're de-risking your recruitment strategy, where you've got 2 or 3 people who are ready to go into that job because you're training them on the competencies for the next role.
Couldn't agree more.
Now part 2, which is the micro, which is you turn it into a coaching scorecard. So day-to-day competencies that the manager is working on with the rep, they're constantly coaching them against these competencies, making sure that they're improving them, completing the loop on the competencies. They're now successfully demonstrating they can do that competency to a good level, a good standard. And again, if your competency framework actually starts demonstrating the maturity curve of that role as well, we can start grading them against the maturity curve of that role. And then lastly, the one that no one ever talks about, but it does have tremendous power, is improvement programs. So some people aren't going to be successful. Some people are going to struggle. Some people aren't right for the role. And you've now got a ready-made scoring system to actually start judging their performance against the competency framework. So I've probably just chucked out 4 or 5 use cases there, but as you can see straight away, they're fundamental. They're like, you can't run a business without it. The worry is that in lieu of a competency framework, someone's going to fill that void, and it's probably going to be the wrong person. So they're going to have awkward conversations that are based on no actual evidence whatsoever, talking about competencies that no one's ever articulated and put their finger on, and maybe aren't even relevant to the role. So I always like to get customers to imagine what those conversations look like without this piece of work, and it's staggering. Sorry, I keep interrupting you. Go on, Karen.
No, it's fine. I want to pick up on one point in there, and that's the kind of manager's viewpoint. And I think it's too easy as a manager, and I've done it myself in the past as a sales manager, to kind of wing it, to kind of do that gut feel. I know where all my team are, but you know what gets forgotten? So many elements get forgotten. So you might have somebody that's brilliant on all their skills, right? But there's a will base, there's a kind of positivity element that they're challenged with that's probably holding them back from being able to exploit all of their brilliant skills. They might not be sharing it, they might not be part of the team. Most managers, whether they're experienced or junior, even more so, don't have those conversations because it doesn't even occur to them to have those conversations because it's not front and center. So all of the conversations they have, whether it's in a one-to-one or otherwise, goes back to how much pipeline have you got? What's your forecast? Why did you miss that forecast? Because they don't have a consistent framework. And I love your analogy that it's a Swiss Army knife, because it absolutely is. It gives everybody structure, transparency, right? So your rep knows what they need to be doing. Your rep knows what the conversation's going to be having in that coaching. Both know that that's a focus area that you've been working on for the last 2 months. Not every one-to-one being a completely different thing based on what just happened yesterday. You've got a consistent thing that you're working to, and that comes back to that blueprint. And I think for managers who are under a high pressure job that's constantly dealing with competing priorities and competing pressures, having that map to come back to say, I now know where I'm having a conversation with you, you know where I'm having a conversation with you, and we all know where we're going, is just like a fundamental building block of anything, and it takes an enormous amount of pressure off.
Yeah, I agree. It's
when
really
you have that.
The point you made before is a real bugbear of mine, because we build a lot of coaching frameworks for organizations, and they feel like they are coaching, right? And they may be coaching to a degree, they may be doing some coaching. Where we find a lot of coaching falls down is that a coaching conversation takes place, and there's been an investment between the rep and the manager over the course of, say, an hour. Let's say they do that 4 times a month, right? So that all of a sudden we're talking about 4 hours work. The biggest piece missing from the coaching is, what are you now going to go and do? Yeah. How are you going to track what you've done? And when are we going to talk about what you've done again to make sure that you're improving in that process? Now, this is the great thing about the competency framework, is it doesn't move on to another competency until you've completed the loop on that competency. Yeah. So you've got evidence that someone is improving in that area, and demonstrating that improvement, and you're both happy with the improvement. If you take that away, coaching conversations just become really, really impotent, right? They're like, yeah, we had the conversation, it went really well. Okay, go and do stuff. Congratulations.
It's like Groundhog Day. Every single time you sit down with your manager and you're thinking, where's the value for me? I've always talked when people think, yeah, but we've got to have pipeline reviews. We've got to do all things. Yeah, you do. But think about where the value is. Who's feeling the value? Because your rep is not feeling any value. They're not walking away from that thinking, I got something out of that. And that's what you've got to fundamentally be able to think. And if you're just having the same one-to-ones, as you say, without any accountability, without any follow-up, without any tracking of improvement, nobody's getting anything out of that. You're just having it for the sake of having it so you can tick a box. And that's just really dangerous and a complete waste of time, frankly, in my mind.
It's shifting people away from outputs and inputs, right? Like, so much time's wasted talking about outputs. There was an incredible study done, and I can never remember where the study was done, but it articulates the importance of input so much, and the importance of coaching on inputs, right? Is that they got two groups of children to do a painting for their parents, and one group of parents had to question around the process that the child used to draw the painting, and the other group just had to congratulate their kids on the painting that they'd done. So the second group was like, well done, you've done a great painting, congratulations, which is just all about output or outcome, right? The second group took the time to question, why did you put the tree there? Why did you pick that color for the sun? Why did you use multiple greens? And then rewarded them on the process. And what they found is that the quality of the work over long term, those that were coached on the inputs got better. Those that were coached on the outputs, there was no improvement opportunities. It was just, well done, well done, well done. And again, I think it's easy to look at it in the negative sense where someone hits their target and then the manager goes, well done, you've hit your target. It's like, great, but that could have been a myriad of different reasons, including luck, market, product, opportunity. Really what we're doing is, how did you get there? And let's model that and get you better at doing it that way. And that's why really looking at the inputs is what drives long-lasting, meaningful output change and behavioral change. And it's such a simple thing. And when you change managers' perspectives on it, they're often like, I get this now. And that's where the competency framework becomes so powerful, because it's the ultimate inputs. Like, what are you doing to achieve what you need to get, right? What are the skills you have? What do you know? What behaviors are you demonstrating? And that's all input, which is so, so powerful.
Yeah, I often ask the question of managers, of your team, who would you have on your bus? If you move to another role in another company, who would you take with you? And often it's not, in fact, more often than not, it's not the highest performer, but they can't put their finger on it. They kind of say, well, because they got it because maybe they had a great partner deal that dropped in, or it was just a really great timing, and it's often, but they can't articulate it. They can't articulate, why is that other person the person you take with you and on the bus? Well, because they do things and they do these things. Right. That's why you need a competency framework, so that you can articulate that and you can get everybody on the bus that you want, that you want to achieve that. Okay, so we've got that kind of operational rhythm in place, and I love the fact that you talked about it starts from interview. It goes into everything, that it's a Swiss Army knife. I love it. And if people can get that into their heads, then they're onto a winner. But a question I often get asked, particularly for kind of younger managers perhaps, is how do you measure it? How do you make it as objective as possible? Because it is open to, oh yeah, but Kate, she's brilliant at problem discovery, because I'm thinking about the output, right? I'm thinking about the fact that she must be, because she's done a number. But how do we make that as objective and as possible, and measure a rep against that competency framework? What things can people do, Aaron?
Well, look, I think we're lucky in what we do, because there is some binary numbers that go into sales, right? But again, think about the competency and think about creative ways of scoring on the competency, right? So knowledge can be scored through test results from the LMS, right? It's like a really easy, simple, quick win, right? I think forecast accuracy, like an obvious one, right? Like that's a competency you want someone to get better at, and there's a measurable that's associated with that as well, right? So again, I think the way I look at it is the knowledge ones are really easy, because you can do some sort of hard scoring through the learning management system as an example, right? I think the skill competency is where it becomes slightly more difficult, but certification is a really good way to go. So building out scorecards, coaching scorecards on those competencies, and certifying people on those competencies, giving them a badge every time they achieve the right score on that competency. They can demonstrate it through role play, demonstrate it through calls, and then have an objective scoring mechanism on the back of that as well. So you can have conversational intelligence now have scorecards built
Yeah.
into them, which is one thing you can use, which is really powerful. We build coaching scorecards for our customers as well, which is also very, very useful. It's very hard to keep it completely objective. There has to be some subjectivity in there, but you define what the evidence looks like on those. And then the kind of foundational skills or the behavioral skills are often very difficult to do, but I think you should always ask reps, if they're building a quarterly review they do with managers, I like to ask them to bring evidence, and almost build a dossier of what they're proud of to bring to the quarterly review, right? So if they feel that they've shown the values in a certain way, bring the evidence, keep a look of it and bring the evidence, and then we can start talking about what that looks like and how they did it, right? But I do think, again, there is a point where there has to be some subjectivity to it because of the nature of the role of the manager and the rep. Another really good thing to do is to get people to score themselves.
Yeah.
And what you start seeing is a couple of really interesting things. You start seeing the gap between the manager score and the rep score, and then there's a really interesting conversation that can take place. And also you start seeing almost their own self-awareness, right? In a good and bad way. So you might see people who think they're killing it at a certain competency, and you're like, I'm sorry, I have to be the harbinger of bad news, but this is actually way off where you are. But the interesting one for me is when people are like, I'm really shit at this competency. And it's like, well, hold on. I've got 5 pieces of evidence and some scoring that shows you're actually not. You're really good at it, right?
Yeah.
And again, these conversations are so helpful, really, really healthy conversations for the manager and the rep to start talking about the gap and how they remove the gap and get closer together. So I know there's a lot of sort of mishmash of different things there, but there should be a suite of scoring mechanisms that's evidence-based, objective, subjective scoring, and also certification is a really powerful way of doing that as well.
Yeah, I agree, Aaron, and I like the full kind of degree of it. I like to think of it in kind of qualitative and quantitative kind of framing. I think you can get consistency across teams by being a little bit more prescriptive on the actual competency itself, rather than just problem discovery. What does that mean? What are we looking for? Are we looking for somebody that always delves deeper into the pain? Are we looking for somebody that spreads the pain into other areas? Are we looking for somebody that uses stories to uncover pain? Those 3 things help the manager when they're doing the scorecarding say, have I observed that? Have I understood that? And that really helps from a qualitative, base in terms of building up that evidence, and the individual rep to say, where are my deficits in that? And then the other side is, as you say, that the kind of quantitative. If I'm smashing the amount of calls I'm putting out there, but my call to meeting ratio is really low in terms of my peers, that would illustrate that there's perhaps a gap between the conversation you're having, the problems you're having, your ability to articulate the solution in converting those conversations. So that's probably an area that we want to focus on, and a good guide that's a challenge. So I think the balance there is really, really nice. Okay, so I think we've got some really practical things that we talked about there. After all of those elements, because I always do this whenever I've trained anybody, when you've taken a lot of stuff on, if I were to ask you to give one piece of practical advice, like one thing to get them to take away, what would it be?
God, there's so many, right? But I think that the key thing for me, and I spoke about it, alluded to it earlier, is the process of building the competency framework is so important, because it creates a language, which now means we're all speaking about the same things. It's going to help with adoption because it creates accountability on what you need to do with it. It loops in the right people for it to become the kind of central thread of the organization's view on performance, onboarding, talent selection, development, coaching. And I think you've got to bring the right people on board the ship before you start building it. The danger is it gets built in isolation and then it's pushed on someone, and then they just see it as another thing they need to fill out every single month. So getting that agreement and that alignment up front does a couple of things, all the things I mentioned there, but it also gets rid of probably about 4 or 5 other programs that they're running at the moment that just aren't as powerful. And then straight away they can go, we can get rid of that because this now does it. We can get rid of that because this now does it. And the other point here is that it actually starts bleeding into other departments as well. So if you've got a recruitment department and you've got a competency framework, you've just made their life so much easier. And on top of that, you can expect them to send you better candidates, right? Yeah. Because they now know what they're looking for. If you've got a human resources department, you need to talk about poor performance. you've got a common language that you're now speaking about. If you want to speak to your superiors about promoting a member of your staff and justifying some salary or some budget for it, you've now got a common language to speak about as well. If you want to talk about your operations team about the knowledge that they need to have to go and do the job successfully, or how you set up Salesforce as an example, you've now got a common language to do that. So it starts actually bleeding into every single area of the business, and everyone starts seeing it as the core thing that's actually creating the language and creating the common vernacular around the sales organization, which is so powerful. So I know I've probably chucked in about 50 pieces of advice. It's about how you start the process, right?
Yeah.
Don't just go about it willy-nilly and do it on your own, or don't just go and build something in a week. Really take the time to understand what it is you're trying to do and bring all the key stakeholders on board. The last thing that we've not discussed is adoption. Like, if you get that part right, you'll get adoption. You don't want it to just be another spreadsheet that's sitting in a dusty old drawer that everyone blows off one day before the QBRs to sort of like retroactively fill in to prove they've done it to HR. That's not enjoyable for anyone. And, the rep likes getting feedback. Typically, if they don't, you've probably hired the wrong person.
Yeah. That's a fundamental flaw.
Why not operationalize it and turn it into an enthusiastic, encouraging event that both parties get value out of? Yeah. So yeah, that would be my long-winded and probably unlettered piece of advice.
So lots of it. Just take all of it. So it sounds like get started, but get started in the right way.
100%,
yeah. And making that beginning of that journey right fundamentally impacts the rest of it. And I think the one thing that I love, the one thing I'm going to loop it all back together is your comment about it being a Swiss Army knife. Yeah. And that realization that people have in their head, all of this scattergunning I've been doing, all of this kind of Groundhog Day, all of this non-value work suddenly goes, hang on a minute, if I bring it all back to this one framework, it's the glue, it's the magnet. One of our clients calls it a magnet. It brings the objectives, it brings the conversations, it brings the performance, it brings the training, it brings everything together, the knowledge share, into a single place that everybody's got that common language. And I couldn't agree more. And it's why we're both Sales Competency Framework geeks, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess the last point, and again, I'm not using this as an advert for your product, but it's a really important point, is that being able to operationalize it so it's easy to use is such an important part of it, because someone's interacting with it so much. If it stays as a spreadsheet, in time you may see adoption sort of tail off a little bit. And that's what I love about your product. And again, I'm completely impartial in this. I don't have a dog in the fight, but being able to actually run it on a platform where it becomes really transparent, easy to use, drag and drop, and then it actually takes away the administrative burden, it becomes so powerful. And also you've got both parties looking at the same screen at the same time and actually working on it together. So I think a tool to actually help you achieve that, again, it doesn't have to be the first thing you do, but certainly when you hit the sort of maturity curve of the competency framework, it's a really good thing to bring in. Now, we always recommend to our clients, don't just go and buy a product to fill a gap. Like, go and build it yourself, get used to using it. And then when adoption's good, then you bring in the product. Managers are like, oh my God, this is life-saving. You bring the product in first, they're like, oh, this is another thing I've got to fill out. So we do feel that, and it's probably not what you want to hear, Kate, but it is important that if you've got someone who's adopted it and they see the value in it and then they turn to technology, it becomes even more powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more on the another spreadsheet, another thing to fill out. And it's so, with sales, we get so much pushed at us, and I think it's so important that we see it as value. Yeah. And to be valuable, it needs to be useful, and it needs to be not an admin burden. And so when that self-realization comes, as you say, the engagement and value really heightens massively. So no, absolutely, I agree. But listen, if I geek out any more on this, we'll be here all day. But and I'm not sure everybody else is as keen on Sales Competency Frameworks as you and I. But I just want to thank you. I say I really could talk about this all day. And I hope to see you again. In fact, next week we're all at Sales Innovation Expo, aren't we? So I'll be able to see you there. So thank you very much, Erin. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and well done for working through and talking through the distracting drill behind you. It's been amazing. No a true example of performance under pressure. And I'll speak to you again soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me. Speak soon.